Good afternoon, everybody, or good evening to some of you who might be dialing in from other parts of the world. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for showing up. I know there's plenty going on right now, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join us for this session. My name is Anand Krishnan, and I'm here to talk about probably the most important security challenge that enterprises in the retail and hospitality industries face, especially going into the holiday season. This is a problem that not only has implications for security, but as you will see, it also has implications for data privacy and even how well your sites behave in terms of top line revenue. Quick word on the agenda before I jump into the content here. We'll start by introducing myself and the company and sort of how the company came about. And then we'll jump into some of the risks that we see when it comes to retail sites. Specifically, we'll focus on security risks, privacy risks, and then revenue risk. And then we'll shift gears to dive into some numbers. As part of this webinar, we did a study of the RH-ISAC member websites that were given to us by the ISAC, and we did a little bit of risk benchmarking. And to give you a flavor for some of the risks that we are seeing in your environments related to security and privacy, which may also have a top-line impact. After that, we will focus on how do you solve this problem, right? Everybody's been talking about Magecart. We're going to present to you 3 different approaches that can stop Magecart, and then we'll talk about the pros and cons of each of them. And then we'll end with a discussion of Tala Solution. What is our technology platform and how does it help solve these problems comprehensively? And most importantly, I'll end with a discussion on some of the exclusive offers that we have for you today. I'm really excited about it, and then we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A, as Joe mentioned. So let me start by kind of introducing myself and the Tala company startup. So here we are based in Silicon Valley. A lot of our founders came out of Symantec, and while we were at Symantec, we actually spent a lot of time in the 2013-2014 timeframe looking at card skimming breaches that were happening in the physical stores, right? Point of sale malware, third-party vendor breaches, etc. I think you're all familiar with that. When we started looking at this problem, and we saw that the movement away from brick and mortar to the online world, the simple question we started with was, how would these kinds of credential skimming or credit card skimming attacks move into the world of online commerce, e-commerce, right? Would the attackers be as successful? And then as we started to peel the onion a little bit and look at how retail websites were architected, we discovered a number of vulnerabilities, which we will talk about in a few slides, that gave us enough reason to realize that not only would these attacks translate from the physical world into the online world, but in fact, they would be successful and they would be able to operate at scale. And that's really the way that Tala got started. Obviously, the problem statement and the use cases have expanded beyond security into privacy and other areas, but the core of Tala's founding mission was to help companies protect their mission-critical web applications against data skimming attacks. So what are some of these risks that we see today? I think some of you may already be familiar with the risks, but we want to present our point of view when it comes to data security, data privacy, and revenue risks that we see on retail websites. The first question is, especially as we are living in this post-COVID world, info security teams have so many things to contend with, right? You're trying to protect employee access, zero trust, you're trying to keep your partners engaged, you're trying to protect your endpoint devices. There's so much going on. How do you prioritize protecting your web assets? And so I want to present a few thoughts here that will hopefully resonate with you. The first one is that if you're looking at your website, your retail websites today, there is so much sensitive information, valuable information that is available to cyber criminals through the browser, right? It could be credit card information, could be user registration information, and all kinds of PII. That information is very valuable for attackers, for cyber criminals, because they can steal it, make a quick buck on the dark web, and they move on to the next retail attack. What we're seeing recently is not only are we seeing large groups such as Magecart, we've now seen nation states get involved in this game. And it's not just Magecart we're talking about Trojans, we're talking about adware, spyware, malicious extensions. All of this ultimately tries to inject code into the browser in order to steal information or do other things. The third aspect, which makes protecting your web assets such an important priority today more than ever before, is the onset of regulatory frameworks such as GDPR, such as CCPA, where security plays a very, very important role in protecting your enterprise against GDPR fines, class action lawsuits, etc. And we've seen this already, where a lot of retailers who've been unfortunately hit with these kinds of breaches not only are contending with security issues, but they also have to face regulatory fines, class action lawsuits, etc. So more than ever before, it's very important that privacy plays a role in the overall, security plays a very important role in the overall privacy posture of your enterprises. Finally, as we know, especially in the environment that we're living in, a lot of you are looking at growing your online business, and we have seen tremendous growth in online revenue across US and North America in general. Web has become such an important source of your business. It's a strategic part of your business, and what we will tell you, explain to you in a little bit, is that if you're not protecting your websites adequately, not only do you face security and privacy challenges, you may also be underperforming when it comes to conversion rates, cart abandonment, and ultimately top-line revenue. So let me double-click a little bit on the data security and data privacy aspects of the Magecart problem. One of the things that we really wanted to do is to open the envelope a little bit, to expand the conversation that we're having around Magecart. A lot of it seems to be very narrow and focused on credit cards, but if you look at the average retail website today, and if you look under the hood of what happens inside a user's browser, what you see is that there's actually a lot of sensitive information that's available to the attacker, right? This could be in the form of a user input, right? I might be going into your site, logging in as a user, or registering for a new account. Or I could be maybe buying a product, in which case I get to the checkout page and I'm entering credit card information. So user input is a very important source of sensitive data that's attractive for cyber criminals. But there's also other ways in which sensitive data could be exposed and available at the browser: cookies, local storage, session storage, JavaScript objects. Sometimes you even have sensitive information that is reflected back from the server into the web page. All of this sensitive information is attractive to the attacker, and this is really the overall scope of what data we're trying to protect. And when it comes to attackers, there are three things they can do with this data. The first one is just have access to it. This is one of the core problems that we'll talk about when we do the risk analysis benchmarking, that today what we find in retail websites is that there is an inordinate number of third-party services that have access to sensitive information. For example, login information. There's no reason for a marketing tool to be able to read my username and password. So access is an important question. The second question is, who's actually reading this data? When you have a website that has dozens and dozens of third parties, it's very important to track not only who's on the site, but who's actually reading the sensitive data within the browser. So you may have a JavaScript library that has access to, let's say, the login information, but isn't reading it. And then you may have another JavaScript library that is actually reading it. So it's important not only document who has access, but who also is actually reading it in the browser. And then the third question is, which of these third parties are actually collecting this information? This could be one of your third-party services that is quite aggressive in its data collection, but it could also be a third party that's being compromised, that's maybe running Magecart code. So it's very important that we track the data along these three metrics: who has access, who has read, and then who's actually collecting that information. And the reason why attackers have been successful with these sort of Magecart-side attacks is, number one, we find that client-side vulnerabilities are skyrocketing, right? Today's web is very client-oriented. There's more and more code getting executed via JavaScript in the browser. Traditional security solutions like web application firewalls really didn't have that client-side visibility. They were focused on server-side attacks. DOM vulnerabilities are on the rise, and if you talk to companies like Google, they'll tell you that this is the #1 vulnerability on the web today. We also face a very significant supply chain sprawl. The average RH-ISAC member website has over 39 different sources of JavaScript coming into my browser, right? If any of those are compromised, or if any of those are aggressive in their data collection practices, we have a data security and data privacy problem. And finally, when it comes to data privacy itself, although there are a lot of tools that provide you with cookie consent and other mechanisms, they simply lack the ability to automate this process of data mapping, and ultimately they don't provide any kind of data governance or protection. And we'll talk more about this. So when we think about the data security and privacy problem, it's very important to look at the entire scope of all of the sensitive data that the attacker has access to at the browser level. The next is revenue risk, right? And this might be surprising in a security conversation, but the reality is when you have redirection attacks, when you have Trojans, when you have adware, spyware, not only are they trying to steal information, in some cases they're trying to steal the users themselves. You may have some kind of redirection that is taking away users from your site and putting them in another site. You may have a user who's trying to buy a product on your retail site, and they have a malicious extension that's injecting an ad for a competitor. What we find is that these sorts of security problems actually lead to revenue issues such as higher cart abandonment and lower web conversion rates. So it's very important that when you think about security, that you also bring in the revenue side of the equation into the conversation. So the question that we face here is, as we get into the holiday shopping season, which is obviously such an important time for all of us, and especially our business, we have these three different objectives. We want to secure data, we want to secure user privacy and data privacy, and at the same time, we want to make sure that we can solve performance issues, that we make sure that the websites continue to perform and provide revenue. Historically, these have been considered to be trade-offs, that if you improve the security, you end up degrading performance and vice versa. In reality, what we find is that if you implement the right solutions, and this is really hopefully the major takeaway of this conversation, is if you can improve site security and have a better handle on data privacy, you actually end up increasing site conversion rates. You're going to see better outcomes. Some of our customers have reported higher conversion rates after they've implemented Tala. Even though the primary use case for Tala is security and privacy, we find that because you are able to not only protect data, you're also able to protect content integrity. You end up improving user experience, reducing cart abandonment, and higher conversion rates. So with that kind of background, let's jump into the risk benchmarking that Tala did for RH-ISAC members. So we got a list of, I think, about 145 different domains, and we did an analysis from the outside in. Oh, what are some of the risks that we see related to JavaScript and other types of vulnerabilities that may expose you to these kinds of security and privacy risks? The first thing is, it's very important to kind of recognize that there's a lot of JavaScript running in these browsers, right? When you go to the average retail website, you're looking at many dozens of third-party JavaScripts that are running. The solution to this is not to get rid of them. Obviously, these are very critical to your business. They are trying to improve your conversion rates. They're there for user tracking, for SEO, etc. So the question really is, how do you manage the risks that these JavaScript sources ultimately bring in? I'll start with a quick summary of the study that we did, and the benchmarking that we did for the Alexa 1000 is available. And as we'll see later on, we're happy to provide you more details on the specific study that we did for the RH-ISAC. The first thing is, when we looked at the RH-ISAC membership base, we found that the average retail site in your membership has over 39 third-party JavaScript services, right? That's a significant number. It's higher than what we find in the average website. Again, it's to be expected to some extent because retailers depend on a lot more third-party services, but it gives you a little bit of a sense of the kind of attack surface we're looking at. If any of those 39 JavaScript services or domains are serving malicious code, then the entire web application inherits all those vulnerabilities. 2/3 of the code that's running in my browser actually comes from these third parties. This is very significant. A lot of you have tools to look for software vulnerabilities, static analysis, dynamic analysis, But if over 2/3 of the code that's executing in my browser comes from third parties, this is code that is written by another company, another organization, another developer team. Any vulnerabilities in that code gets inherited by your website. And if those domains are compromised, they could be serving malicious code directly into my browser. The third aspect that we will talk about is the use of security controls. There are lots of security controls, standards-based security controls that are available, and we find that only a small fraction of the RH-ISAC membership is actually using them effectively today. Only 7% of sites use things like content security policy, which is a free technology that is very powerful against protecting many of these vulnerabilities. When we look at standards, open source tools such as Mozilla Observatory, we find over 3/4 of all the memberships get an F rating. So there's definitely lots of room for improvement, which I think is the opportunity ahead of us. And hopefully, you will be able to work on reducing some of these vulnerabilities between now and the shopping season. The fourth aspect is form data. We talked about the different kinds of data that attackers have access to within the browser, and one important source of information is obviously forms. Magecart and Magecart type attackers traditionally have gone after credit card information that the user types into a form. What we find is that the way these websites are designed and the use of third parties integrated into these sites, we find that the average information or the average form is exposing sensitive information to over 15 domains, right? This means that there are 15 domains that simply don't have any reason to look at certain information, have access to that. This is one of the primary vehicles through which attackers are able to get in. And there is just no access control at the level of the browser, and that is the exploit that attackers are using. And then finally, when we look at data at large, we find that it's not just form-based information. There are dozens of cookies being stored on an average website, several local key value pairs stored in local storage and session storage. Tala completely and comprehensively analyzes all the data stored within the browser, sensitive data entered by the user, as well as who has access to it. Now let's get into a little bit more detail on each of these, starting with JavaScript, right? As I mentioned, when you look at the code running in the average retail website's browser, what we find is that over 2/3 of this code actually comes from third parties. When you look at how this compares with the Alexa 1000, right? Tala, a couple of months ago, did our second edition of the Alexa 1000 report, where we look at the top 1000 Alexa websites. We find that number is a little bit lower. Again, this is to be expected to some extent because clearly retail sites are more dependent on third-party services than, let's say, financial or other industries. But this means that your exposure to Magecart types attacks is more significant than other industry verticals. Then we look at the number of unique third parties that are actually sending JavaScript. This is probably the most important takeaway here, which is on average, we find that one of your retail websites includes at least 39 of these JavaScript services, right? Over 45% of them actually include more than that number. So we're looking at a very significant third-party JavaScript exposure. Any of that JavaScript, any of the vulnerabilities in that JavaScript, if any of those domains are compromised, your website gets compromised. The browser is not available for the attacker to execute their code. Another aspect of JavaScript that is problematic is the dynamic nature. As you know, a lot of times we have statically loaded JavaScript, but also a lot of those JavaScript files may have dependencies and they end up pulling in fourth parties and fifth parties and so on and so forth. This is a problem that colloquially we call piggybacking. And what we find is that when you look at the JavaScript that's executing in the browser, we find that over 60% of that code is actually loading dynamically. What this means is that, first of all, these dynamic scripts could have unexpected behavior. And by definition, you have lower visibility into these dynamic scripts. And it's very hard to maintain a good inventory of these dynamic scripts. This is why this problem of Magecart is is harder to solve because of the dynamic nature of JavaScript loading. And what we see here is over 60% of the script that's executing the browser is actually dynamically loaded. We've talked a lot about JavaScript, and obviously JavaScript is one of the fundamental vehicles that attackers have used, but it's very important to remember that it's not just JavaScript that you need to keep track of. There are other sources of content that could be used by exploited by attackers. So for example, iframes, which are very, very important, because recently we found that Magecart in fact is using iframe injection as a way to bypass security controls, right? So when you're looking at let's say a credit card checkout page that's accepting credit cards, the attacker is able to inject their own iframe on top of the actual iframe on your page, whereby they can bypass all of the security controls, the access controls that may be imposed by a security solution. So it's very important that you expand the scope of the conversation beyond just JavaScript. In fact, we find that style sheets have been used for data exfiltration. So here again, we find that on average, there is another couple of dozens of sources of content, images, iframes, beyond just JavaScript, that now you have to be able to inventory, monitor, and be able to block any kind of anomalous activity. Cross-site scripting continues to be a very, very important vector by which Magecart is exploiting a lot of websites. And what we find is that a lot of the code, when Tala is not only able to do analysis of domains, we actually analyze all the JavaScript that runs in the browser. We find that the JavaScript, the way they are coded, introduces possibilities for attackers to inject into the DOM directly. The use of functions such as eval and document.write and inner HTML, we find that almost all of the RH-ISAC membership websites have JavaScript code that is utilizing these sorts of functions, and these sorts of functions increase the possibility of DOM injections, which is not only very hard to detect with existing static and dynamic analysis tools, but it's becoming a very, very important vehicle. If you talk to Google, who actively monitors their own web properties, they'll tell you that DOM XSS is one of the most common web security vulnerabilities and probably the fastest growing segment. We talked a little bit about form data exposure. So what we mean by form data exposure is we analyze the RH-ISAC websites. If there is a form, it could be a login form, it could be a contact form, or it could be a user registration form. We look at the form, we look at the information entered by the user, we take snapshots of it, and then we ask ourselves the question, who has access to this form data? Remember that there were 3 questions we asked when it comes to sensitive data: who has access to the data, who's reading the data, and then who's actually collecting the data. The first question is who has access to that data. And what we find is that on an average retail website within the RH-ISAC membership base, there is a lot of exposure of this form data. Over 15 different domains have access to this kind of sensitive information, which could be user registration data, it could be passwords, login information, credit card information, etc. This is one of the main exposures that Magecart uses. If this exposure weren't there, Magecart would not be as successful in orchestrating their credit card skimming attacks. So this is really around the code and the content related risks, and there's a lot more information that we have that we can share with you if you're interested offline. But I wanted to switch gears to now talk a little bit about security controls. A lot of you have heard about things like content security policy, strict transport, HSTS, refer policy, SRI, iframe sandboxing. There is a whole slew of security controls and standards that are available through the W3C and HTML5 that are very powerful and that can actually help you detect and block many of these attacks. And what we find is that only a small fraction of the RH-ISAC membership base is really utilizing these, right? If we look at the effectiveness of these policies, so even though there are about 6% of the websites have some kind of content security policy, we find almost none of them have a really good CSP policy, right? And this is problematic. So if you look at your website and you try to understand or calculate the security rating for your website, through something like Mozilla Observatory, what we find is that most websites get a grade of F, right? Over 110 of the websites in the RH-ISAC membership base get an F rating, which means that these websites don't have any of these security controls, such as content security policy, sub-resource integrity, HSTS, and so on and so forth. This obviously means that there's plenty of room for improvement. The problem with these ratings is not only are these ratings a good indicator of how well your websites are protected, it is also being used by cyber risk rating companies. So, if you get a poor rating, this may actually impact your cyber insurance premiums as well. Another reason for you to consider improving the kind of security control implementations that you have on your website. Okay. So this is sort of the quick summary of the analysis we've done for the RH-ISAC membership. And as I mentioned, we've also done an equivalent study for the Alexa 1000. And if you're interested in getting specific details about your websites and the risk that we see, we're happy to provide that to you. It's one of our offers to RH-ISAC members that you will see later in the presentation. Now I'm going to switch gears and talk about solutions, right? So far, we've really discussed the risks related to data privacy and data security, even top-line risks. We've given you a little bit of a taste for the kinds of risks that you as retailers face heading into the shopping season. The next question is, how do you stop them? And I want to start by discussing the three main approaches that we've seen in the marketplace, the pros and cons of each of them, and then how the Tala solution and Tala platform works. And then we'll jump into the offers that we have for you. So let me start by talking about these three different approaches that we're seeing in Magecart protection. The big takeaway, honestly, is that there is no silver bullet. But with that, these are three powerful approaches that we've seen companies try to employ in their Magecart strategies. The first one is what we will call a scan and report type approach. In a scan and report type approach, what we have is a solution that is essentially going to scan your website, right? It's going to come in from the outside in and try to analyze your website and identify or try to identify if there are any skimmers, if there's any JavaScript that's behaving maliciously. It may look for certain indicators of compromise by looking at third-party intelligence sources, etc. These scanning solutions, the main advantage is it requires no installation, right? You are able to get some level of Magecart detection without really installing anything. The issues or the disadvantages of the approach is that, most importantly, these solutions don't offer any protection. If you have a breach or if you have a Magecart attack happening, these solutions will not block the attack. So you may be exposed for several days, depending on the scan frequency, and you are now facing a breach. And as we've seen, in just a few days, attackers are able to steal several hundreds of thousands of credit card data. The second issue with these approaches is that by and large, they tend to be very, very prone to false positives. And this is just the nature of anomaly detection. These websites are so complex. They have so many different sources of code. These different JavaScripts are doing multiple things, exhibiting multiple behaviors. If something changes, how do you determine whether the change was good or bad? And as a result, what we find is a lot of these scanning solutions are very prone to false positives. The third limitations with these solutions is actually the scan scope itself. As you know, when you're a retailer and you have a retail website, you may have a marketing page, you may have a product page, but ultimately your users are performing some complex human interactions. They are choosing a product, comparing a product, putting it into the cart, and then checking it out. Or maybe they're creating a new account. These scanners don't have the ability to scan these different complex workflows. As a result, they fail to look at the most sensitive parts of your application. So you may have Magecart compromise just your checkout page or just your user registration page, and these scanners simply wouldn't catch it. So that's the kind of scanning and reporting approach that we're seeing. The second approach is what we would broadly classify as JavaScript virtualization. What do we mean by JavaScript virtualization? The idea is that these security solutions inject their own JavaScript into your website. And so when the user visits your website, they're getting this additional piece of JavaScript, and that additional JavaScript acts as some kind of a monitoring device. And that monitoring, if it observes any kind of anomalous activity, maybe another JavaScript is trying to access sensitive data, access form data, then these JavaScript, the good JavaScript, so-called good JavaScript, can actually block them or detect and block them. The advantage with this approach is JavaScript injection is a fairly well understood technology. You guys are already injecting a lot of JavaScript, so this becomes just another JavaScript. So from an implementation standpoint, it seems fairly trivial. When you inject JavaScript, it can also provide you lots of telemetry from the browser. It can help you understand certain specific behaviors. For example, it can help you understand who's reading sensitive data from the browser. But JavaScript virtualization and insertion actually inherits a lot of problems, specifically related to latency and other performance issues. Obviously, your retail websites are the primary sources, are one of the primary sources of revenue. First things like time to first paint, block time, JavaScript execution times. These are very important performance metrics that have a direct correlation with user experience, cart abandonment, and website conversion rates. What we find is when you inject any kind of JavaScript in order to virtualize the browser, and you measure the performance impact of these JavaScripts using standard tools, popular tools like Google Lighthouse or Web Page Test, you find that in fact, these virtualization engines can add several hundreds of milliseconds of latency, and in some cases, multiple seconds of latency. So performance takes a very big hit when you inject these kinds of virtualization engines, and that impacts top line immediately. These solutions are also vulnerable to lots of different attacks. They're vulnerable, for example, to overlay attacks, where the attacker, instead of using your form to exfiltrate data, they inject their own form on top of the page. And these solutions fail to defend against those attacks. Single point of failure. If this particular virtualization engine fails to load, the page may stop loading. They become a choke point. So if this becomes a very important source of failure for the entire website. And finally, the attacker actually can see the entire code. This is just another JavaScript, which means that an attacker can see all the code that's within the security solution as anybody else, which means it's prone to reverse engineering. And so for all these solutions, although virtualization is a good technology in theory, in practice, it creates so many performance and latency issues that we have to use it very, very, very carefully. The third approach is the standards-based approach. I already alluded to it a little bit when we talked about the Mozilla Observatory ratings, where we have a slew of standards-based controls like content security policy and sub-resource integrity and HSTS, etc. If you implement all these security controls together, not only do you get an A+ in the cybersecurity ratings, you actually have a wonderful way to detect the presence of Magecart, block Magecart, and be able to get telemetry right from the browser. And there are several advantages to it, right? It gives you broad attack coverage. Today you have security controls that not only protect you against Magecart, it'll protect you against clickjacking and cross-site scripting. It'll protect you against cryptojacking. It'll protect you against privacy breaches. For example, there is a new security control called feature policy that allows you to monitor and control who has access to the camera and the microphone on your websites. It has a very, very broad coverage when it comes to attack surfaces. The second advantage of it is it's proven, right? These technologies are being actively used by the likes of Google to protect their mission critical, high volume, high traffic websites every single day. The third advantage is that these standards are flexible. New and better controls are being added all the time. We talked about DOM-based attacks. Google is coming out with a new approach, a new standard called trusted types that allow you to have a better handle on these DOM injection attacks. So the advantages are it's proven, there's a community of people working behind it, this is not a proprietary solution, and it's flexible. The disadvantages are that, number one, these technologies can be very difficult to implement. A lot of companies, and Tala talks to a lot of companies who try to implement these controls and they struggle. Policy generation can be a problem. How do you maintain these policies? At the end of the day, your website is going to change. Your marketing team wants to add new content. Maybe your site engineering team wants to add an analytics service. You have to constantly update these policies. If not, they may, in some cases, disrupt your site's performance. The second challenge is alert volume. Although these standards are wonderful sources of telemetry, somebody has to actually look at the data to make sense of it. When you implement content security policy on a high traffic retail website, such as those that we've seen in the RH-ISAC, you're going to get hundreds of thousands of alerts a day simply from content security policy. Who's going to look at this and be able to identify if it's a real attack, if it's noise coming from browser extensions, or is it just a false positive? That the management becomes a problem. So each of these approaches has several critical strengths, but also certain weaknesses, and really there isn't a silver bullet. And now I want to kind of switch gears and talk a little bit about the Tala solution and our platform and how we're different from what we're seeing in the marketplace. We are the only solution that combines the best of all of these three approaches we talked about. We talked about scanning and reporting, we talked about virtualization, and we talked about standards-based protection. Tala combines all these approaches in one single solution that provides the best of all three approaches without the disadvantages of any of them. So when it comes to scanning and report, we talked about the fact that these scanners suffer from lack of comprehensive scanning, right? They don't get to the sensitive parts of your application. They don't scan, for example, checkout pages, etc. With the Tala scanner, we get in-depth, comprehensive scans for all your web applications and websites. We support complex workflows. This could be user authenticating into your application. It could be user registration. It could be product discovery, where a user is coming into your website and trying to maybe discover a product that they want to buy. Or perhaps user goes all the way to putting it in the shopping cart and then checking out. We support all these workflows, which means we are able to analyze all of the sensitive parts of the application. Secondly, we also have intelligent change analysis, where we're able to look at the changes in your website, not only at the domain level, but also at the JavaScript level. This means that our scanner is much better at analyzing the behaviors of your site, analyzing sensitive parts of your application, and detecting anomalous behaviors. Tala also implies JavaScript virtualization. The difference being, we recognize that if you use virtualization engines in real time, in inline deployments, you are going to see a significant latency problem, performance problem. And if you depend on virtualization as your only security solution, as we said, it can be easily bypassed, it can be circumvented. The key advantage of JavaScript virtualization is that it allows us to identify and document behaviors in a more refined way. So Tala uses JavaScript virtualization, but we use it synthetically. We use it when we do the scan. So we get all the benefits of the behavioral analysis. We're able to understand which third parties reading your data, etc. But we don't burden your website with all of those performance degradations. We don't create a single choke point. We don't create a single point of failure. So this is the biggest distinction between us and some of the competitors who use virtualization technology, where they exclusively depend on virtualization. And then finally, standards-based protection. This is what Tala has historically been known for. We help companies automate and deploy and maintain CSP, SRI, iframe sandboxing, refer policy, HSTS, and so on and so forth. We have constantly expanded our capabilities. More importantly, we help solve one of the most critical challenges that companies face when they implement this solution, which is, how do I make sense of all of the telemetry that you get? So Tala actually employs all three approaches, except that we do it in an intelligent way where we get the benefit of these three approaches without inheriting any of the disadvantages. So I want to quickly give you an overview of the Tala tech platform. It starts with an automated in-depth scan. We do a fully dynamic scan. As I said, we support all the complex workflows. We do data tracking. During our scanning process, we identify forms, we identify cookies, local storage, session storage, and we identify if there's sensitive data being entered or stored in any of these repositories. And then we track it across those 3 dimensions: which JavaScript has access to it, which JavaScript is actually reading it, and which JavaScript is exfiltrating it through the network. We then do in-depth behavioral analysis. We look for not just JavaScript-based behaviors, we also look for other sources of attacks such as iframes and images. We actually do lightweight static analysis to be able to identify coding risks, surface JavaScript libraries that are using eval or document.write, which might be exposing DOM injection points to attackers. And then we do threat and anomaly detection. We continuously monitor your website to look for changes and see if any of the existing domains are gone rogue, if the JavaScript behaviors have changed, and then we alert you. We also integrate with a lot of third-party intelligence to give you the best possible view into Magecart. And none of these actually requires any installation. These 4 things require no installation. If you want real-time protection, analytics, and be able to implement these security controls, you instrument Tala, and we provide lots and lots of options for instrumenting Tala. And we are able to support CSP, SRI, HSDS, iframe sandboxing, referral policy, etc. We have a very clean workflow that allows you to get from reporting only to block mode very quickly. We have a complex analytics platform that allows us to look at all the alerts that come back and determine whether it's a false positive, a piece of noise, or a real attack. And we help you improve your cyber rating scores by virtue of implementing these security controls. So it's only the last piece that requires instrumentation. The rest of them actually are done from the outside in and don't require any instrumentation. So with that, I'm going to finish our conversation here today with probably the most exciting part, which is the exclusive offers that we have for RH-ISAC members. There are 3 levels at which you can engage with us and utilize us for your security strategy as you look into the shopping season. The first option is to simply try to understand the risk. If you email us, we'll be able to give you the RH-ISAC statistics that I shared in more detail. We'll be able to give you the Alexa 1000 report. We can also do a specific in-depth analysis of one of your websites, and that includes a kickoff call where we will kick off the scan of your website and then offer you consultation on where we see the risks and what kind of mitigation approaches you can take. That's the risk study option. The second option is Magecart detection. For 2 months, we will give you free detection for up to 2 critical pages of your website. And what we will include in that is a demo of the detection capabilities. We will set up a consultation call where we will go through the data that we get and help you understand whether or not or how to look for the presence of Magecart. And this also includes support, email support. And here you can use our services just to be able to detect Magecart through the shopping season. The third level at which you can engage with Tala is through full protection. Here you're getting all of the services and all of the technologies that we have in our platform. And for up to 5 domains and sites, you're able to get all of this for free for 3 months upon signing a trial agreement. So these are the 3 different offerings that we have, and this is exclusive to the RH-ISAC members.